Hello, my friends. It is Saturday, February 8th, 2025, and this is three big stories. Actually, it's four big stories today. And the biggest story is about the Russian economy and the problems that are going on with it. And tied to that, another story is how Trump may intentionally or inadvertently accelerate that. So we'll get into that. Let's start with this news from, well, I talked about it yesterday, but it happened today. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, that is the Baltic states, have disconnected their electricity systems from Russia's power grid to integrate the countries more closely with the European Union and boost security. So if you're looking at the map, Estonia, there are power grids coming from Finland into Estonia, from Sweden into Lithuania, and from Poland into Lithuania as well. In fact, they made a big show of this in Lithuania by actually showing the guy cutting the lines. So that's a pretty big thing to them right now. Lithuania released footage of the literal cutting of power lines transporting electricity from Russia. Russia-occupied Kaliningrad enclave is now on its own. There's still gas pipeline going from Russia to Kaliningrad through Lithuania. Hopefully that will be next. So if you're wondering what we're talking about, Kaliningrad is this little slice of Russia here that after World War II, it was German territory. The Lithuanians didn't want it, the Poles didn't want it, and so Russia seized it. Okay, so that's big story number one. Big story number two, Zelensky confirms that talks with Trump's team is now happening. It's underway. Teams from Ukraine and U.S. President Donald Trump are working on details for upcoming negotiations. Now, with that, they're talking about like the rare earth minerals and that sort of thing, or rare earth metals, I suppose I should say. Zelensky ruled out simply giving away Ukraine's minerals to the U.S., but he offered partnership. Okay, he said that America would have priority access to these minerals due to their biggest military aid. And so he shaped this, I think, this is my speculation now. I think he shaped that victory plan knowing that if Trump comes to office, point 5 of the victory plan was that partnership with this sort of thing in order to appeal to what he knows about Trump. And I think that was very wise if that's what was going on. Zelensky noted that Putin had seized trillions of dollars worth of Ukrainian resources by snatching up these 4 oblasts, and that in the event of a ceasefire, without the occupation of the territories, he would be able to use these resources to prepare for a new war. The president noted that it's fair to talk about the assistance in the deoccupation of the territories because a simple ceasefire will only allow Russia to develop these seized resources. You see how clearly these things are tied together? This is a brilliant stroke on Zelensky's part, in my estimation. And by the way, look at the size of that table. We'll come back to that in just a little bit. Okay, now the next story here is what's going to happen with Trump and how that's going to take place next week. And so this is kind of a bridge between the last story and the next. President Trump announced a meeting with President Zelensky that might take place next week. During the meeting, Ukraine's natural resources and the end of the war would be discussed. President said, he added that this administration wants to protect Ukraine's underground resources. I mean, it's not because he's benevolent. Donald Trump also noted that no one would, quote, use the United States anymore, unquote. So Washington needs to do something in exchange for the money spent on Ukraine. And so this is a way of tying Ukrainian interest and American interest together. And that's the way that Donald Trump tends to think. Okay, so that's big story number 1 and 2. Now, as we have that in the back of our mind, like that's the backdrop for what we're about to see here. So I saw this and I thought, well, that's interesting. This is Sputnik, and this is Alexander Dugin, and he's talking about this. Trump's taking the sledgehammer to globalism, Dugin's digital edition. You don't have to like Trump, but as AI Dugin explains, there is no denying that he's destroying globalist liberalism from within. I'm going to let him explain what he means here. But first, Michael McFaul said Putin's ideologues love what Trump and Musk are doing. Shouldn't that give us Americans some pause? Maybe we have a congressional hearing on it all so that the American people can understand what is the strategy. Now, this is Dugin with a voiceover interpreter made with AI. So I thought the AI was interesting, but just listen to what he has to say and then we'll talk about it. Okay, here we go.
What has transpired in the United States following Donald Trump's victory in the presidential elections, the inauguration process, and the transfer of power demonstrates that we are witnessing a rapid process of conservative revolution in the U.S.
Stop. It's not a conservative revolution. It is a populist revolution. They look similar, but they're very different in nature. So he's going to get some things right and he's going to get some things wrong, and we have to be able to tell the difference.
The system of values is changing in a direction almost diametrically opposed to its previous trajectory. The principles Trump and his team are proclaiming, along with the initial steps they are taking, stand in complete contradiction to the left liberal ideology underpinning the orientations, strategies, and actions of the globalists. Essentially, what is happening today is a profound transformation and even a schism within the West into two poles. One of these poles remains left liberal and globalist. It has been embodied by Biden and almost all his predecessors, including Republican George W. Bush Jr., who posed no alternative to the left liberal agenda.
Okay, so left, liberal, and globalist. So, so being involved in the international community, Biden thought that he was supposed to be very involved. But so did George Bush, so did George W. Bush, so did Reagan. Like, they thought that they should be involved. Now, there was a difference between the way that Reagan approached this and the way that Biden approached that. But they were still involved in the rest of the world. So he would call this globalist as opposed to a Trumpian populist. Now, he calls it conservative, but I call it populist isolationism, which is not conservative in any meaningful way. It's populist.
The second pole, however, is Trump and Trumpism itself. This is conservative America.
No, this is populist MAGA America. There's a difference.
Which has essentially rejected left liberal ideology entirely.
It has done that, but it's also rejected being involved in the world, the globalism, so I'm not a globalist, but I'm not an isolationist either. You have to be involved in what's going on in the world to stop bad things from happening, like what should have happened in the 1930s to stop Hitler. But that's different than just let's be involved in everything. There's a difference here.
Advocating instead right conservative principles. Notably, this is no longer even right liberal, but distinctly right conservative, as many represent.
It's not conservative. There's a difference. He's using the term wrong here, and that might be a translation issue, but I don't think that's a translation issue. I think that's the way that he sees what conservatism is, and it's really populism, which is a rejection. It's a, what about us? Everything should be about America first. Everything should be about us. And whatever's going on over there, it doesn't really matter to us.
Representatives of the Trumpist camp speak of post-liberal values and outright rejection of liberalism as such. The very word liberal is becoming a slur in America.
Well, that's interesting because the conservatives I know and the liberals, I mean pre-Trump liberals, not progressives, but many pre-Trump liberals and most of the conservatives I know actually miss old-fashioned conservatism and liberalism, as opposed to the progressivism that has gone one direction and the MAGA populism that has gone another.
These changes are occurring so dynamically and rapidly that many have not yet grasped just how substantial these transformations are, both for the West as a whole and for American society in particular. Globalist left liberal values are being replaced by traditional ones.
Oh, no. That's not traditional values necessarily. So now he's partly right, because the progressive nature of things, trans this and DEI that and that sort of thing is being rejected by conservatives and populists simultaneously within the United States. He is right about that.
There is a shift from liberal progressivism to conservatism and even traditionalism. In fact, Trump and the Trumpists are promoting a value system closely aligned with the one proclaimed by Russia.
No, that's not true at all. So when he talks about traditionalism in the United States and traditionalism in Russia are two very different things. The conservative, what we used to do, rolling back the clock a few decades, is different than what traditionalism, meaning authoritarian, follow the leader in Russia, night and day. It's not the same, but he's using the same terms, confounding us.
In this regard, Putin's decree number 809 on traditional values, Russia's ban on the promotion of perversions and gender politics, the emphasis on patriotism, prioritizing the spiritual over the material, and many other foundational principles are now being realized by Trump. Welcome.
Okay, no, it's not the same thing. And the spiritual over the material in Russia. Okay, so here's the thing. Tulsi Gabbard was being interviewed by the Senate before being, what will hopefully not be a confirmation, but probably will be a confirmation. And somebody pointed out, like, they should have asked her about, like, Putin's persecution of Christians, because we hear Tucker Carlson talk about how Zelensky's persecuting an entire religion, the Russian Orthodox Church. Well, there's a reason that they're outlawed, because they're a funnel for the FSB. But what's happening with Russia? So here's what's happening with Russia. And this is, if you're not familiar with CBN, that's a Christian broadcasting network. Think Pat Robertson, right? And so there's a documentary that they're highlighting here that talks about how Putin is actually persecuting Christians. That would flip out the American Christians, those on the right, with many that actually voted for Donald Trump, not realizing that the difference between conservative and not progressive, conservative and the value system that comes with populism. Okay, let's look at this.
A new documentary seeks to expose the truth about religious persecution in Ukraine.
That is Russian persecution in occupied Ukraine.
Role in this struggle is so critical.
We come to minister to them, to see them, to listen to them.
It's called A Faith Under Siege.
There's a lot of propaganda out there. Our thesis was, you don't fight propaganda with more propaganda, you fight propaganda with truth. And the best truth is personal stories of folks that are there, that have lived this kind of stuff.
The documentary features firsthand accounts of pastors, aid workers, and believers who have been captured, tortured, or forced to flee because of their faith.
The folks that stayed in these war-torn areas to help and to minister to their folks and to others, to provide aid, were really doing some amazing stuff. When the Russians took over and found these evangelicals, they find them very threatening.
Okay, so we're going to stop there. So that is how the Russians deal with their traditional values, and it's something very different. So I want to make that kind of distinction. Okay, now let's talk about Trump otherwise in other ways. Like, there are some things that Trump may do that's very good for Ukraine, and some things that he's doing that are like, how does that help anything? Or is that just a bull in the china shop kind of thing? So here, Jeremy, adjusted for inflation, posted this. Easterly is probably the most famous critic of foreign aid within academia, but he knows the Trump administration is acting illegally. Now, I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm not sure whether this is legal or not, because it's almost like using a line item veto when he just dismantles an entire department. But okay, let's read this. When I called Easterly last week to ask him about these developments, his tone was far from celebratory. It's illegal and it's undemocratic, he said. The slashing of tactics adopted by Musk and Trump. Even if I like the idea of moving away from aid, I cannot condone this horrific way to go about this. Okay, so that's what he was saying. This is a famous critic of foreign aid saying that. So, but the method... Okay, so it's the method that Trump is using that is in line with the populism of just smash the system. Okay, so Marshall McLuhan said the medium is the message. I said the other day that the method that Trump is using is the message. The method is the message. He's saying, see, we're just going to do this thing. And in doing these things, he's like saying, like, see, I can do this thing. Okay, so Gary Kasparov says, yes, focus on the method as much as choice of targets, even if you don't like the foreign aid, consumer protection, science, health, FBI, CIA, and want them to be gutted. Doing so without legal channels and oversight will soon lead to the same methods against things you do like. He's right about that. But see, it's the method that the populists want to just tear the thing down. Now, when I say that, I say this. There's a court order right now. U.S. court temporarily blocks Trump's plan to withdraw USAID staff worldwide. So they've gotten involved, and we'll see how that ruling all plays out and whether the USAID will be salvaged or whether they'll be allowed to go on and do that. But here, I want you to understand that conservatives have for years said, hey, we need to slim down the size of government. Okay, and there's a reason for that. Here's Reagan talking about this kind of thing in a joking kind of way.
I think you all know that I've always felt the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
Okay, so I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Why? Because the government can do certain things well, and most things it does very inefficiently. And so conservatives look at this and they think, wait a minute, let's privatize these functions. Now, I don't mean let's give it to the oligarchs so that the oligarchs can become oligarchs. In fact, we don't think in those kind of terms or in those kind of categories. They do think in terms of, the DMV, it's terrible. Let's have like private sector run this efficiently rather than that. It's that sort of thing. That's the way that they process this. Now, even during the Reagan administration, I just put this into some AI. What are areas of government that Reagan called for cutting back? Cutting federal spending on social programs and government regulations and federal bureaucracy and taxes and government and education and the arts, like the National Endowment for the Arts, particularly, or reducing federal spending on the federal education agency. Let the states do that. That's where properly, the more local, the better is the mentality, right? Foreign aid and international program. Reagan advocated for reducing foreign aid, particularly to countries that he viewed as not aligned with U.S. interests. Okay, so doing that is a more systematic way of doing it, but conservatives historically talk more about it than actually did it. Trump's actually doing these things, and he's kind of like a bull in a china shop. And it's yet to be determined whether this bull in a china shop is going to be a bull in a china shop that's just tearing things down in the U.S., or maybe it's going to be affecting Russia. Now, here's what I mean by affecting Russia. So his unpredictability, his wild cardness is the kind of thing that I want to focus on here. Trump is ready to tighten sanctions on Russia to end the war. Ukraine, as their impact is now, sanctions is just 3 out of 10, said Kellogg yesterday. So they can ratchet up those sanctions. And then what if Trump is a bull in a china shop to the Russians? Well, their economy's already in very bad shape. Now, Che Bowles is going to say, no, that's doing great. Russia's GDP is up 4.1%. Real wages grew by 8.4%, and unemployment down 2.3%. He said nothing about inflation or the actual figure, the official figure, or the actual figure, which is even higher about inflation. So the economy's not doing well in Russia. Here's Anton Gerashenko. I've gathered some facts and trends about the Russian economy, overheated war economy. India and Turkey have decreased their purchases of Russian coal by almost 40%, and that's because of logistical complications. China has decreased its imports of Russian coal by 7%, but 25% in terms of money. Currency reserves in Russian banks fell to a 16-year low. Foreign currency reserves fell by 40%. $52 billion were taken by personal accounts after hundreds of thousands of Russians fled the country. So there's a brain drain effect as well. Businesses took out another $44 billion. You don't take money out of the system if the system's doing well. You take it out when it's doing poorly, right? Production of agriculture equipment has declined sharply. Goldman Sachs, a top 10 bank in the U.S., left. ING just left. It's from the Netherlands. It's also set to leave Russia. Turkey refused to unblock functioning of Russian cards within the Mir payment system. After Western payments systems stopped working with Russian banks, Russians used Mir cards to be able to pay abroad. About a year ago, Turkey stopped accepting the Mir cards for fear of secondary sanctions from the United States. What if Trump does secondary sanctions in a meaningful way that just becomes a bull in the china shop? Look, he's shown that he's willing to just tear down systems. Like, let's tear down USAID. Let's tear down this. Let's remove this department. What might he do? And so that's the question. What might he do with Russia? And we just don't know yet. Kremlin publicly gave up the idea of BRICS currency after Trump publicly threatened to introduce 100% tariffs in the case of the currency is implemented. Now, he's shown his willingness with tariffs with Canada and Mexico. I don't know what was going on there, but maybe he's willing to do things that other previous politicians were not able or willing to do. So it's that bull in a china shop effect. Now, there are other things that are going on. So here, I saw this. Superjet flights canceled at Pulkovo. More than 30 Sukhoi Superjet 100 flights were canceled at the St. Petersburg airport. The official cause was high atmospheric pressure. But interestingly, the cancellations affected only Superjet aircraft. High pressure does not prevent other types of aircraft from flying. So the Russian economy has problems, and airline or aircraft maintenance is one of those things because they can't get parts and things along those lines. So the economy is ailing, and Trump may, by his actions, make it worse for the Russians. Maybe inadvertently, maybe intentionally, we just don't know. But he could be that bull in the china shop. We don't know. He's a wild card, and we just can't tell at this point yet, but that's happening. Okay, remember I told you about the table earlier that Zelensky was sitting at? It was a little circular table. Here's a famous table. On this day in 2022, Darth Putin posted this. I gave Emmanuel Macron my personal assurances that I would not invade Ukraine. So you can trust any promise that we make now. All right, my friends, that's all that I have. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, and the subscribes. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.